There are a good few of us here today, so thank you everyone for coming. For those of you on this, of our second of our webinars for this early season, my name is Laurie Piper. I'm the Chief Executive of Visit Moray Speyside. We are Scotland's third tourism bid, and in a fit of terrible planning, we launched the brand new organisation with its 5-year plan on the 1st of April. So we've made some amendments and some refocusing to our immediate plan. What we're trying to do just now at the moment is make sure that you as tourism businesses in Moray Speyside have as much access to guidance and support and insight as possible at this stage, as we begin to look a little bit forward into the future to tourism reopening. I expect that will come up in the Q&A at the end. I don't want to detain anybody unnecessarily, so what we'll do is we'll crack on just now. I want to introduce Duncan Stewart and Jim Eccleston of 56 Degree Insight, who will give you a bit of a background on themselves, and then will take us through the second wave of results from the Tourism Index survey. Questions, if you have them, send them in through the Q&A bit. I have a little sheaf of questions here, which we'll go through at the end, and I'm fairly sure there's time to have a general chat. So without any further ado, I shall say thank you and hand over to Duncan and Jim, I hope seamlessly.
Yeah, I think so. Jim here. I'm going to try and share my screen, so hopefully you can all see that. Thank you, Laurie, and to everyone for joining today's webinar, especially on a Friday. Countdown to the weekend, I know, but hopefully we'll keep this as interesting and useful as possible. We're delighted to have the opportunity to share the results from this survey with all of you. It's a really, really tough time at the moment for everyone, but especially the tourism industry. And we feel it's important to get as much market intelligence in your hands as possible to help you through this crisis and hope to give you some guidance. A little bit of background about Duncan and myself, if I can get it to move on. There we go. We both formed 56 Degree Insight just over a year ago, a market research and insights consultancy. We cover a lot of different sectors, tourism being a very important one for us. And reflecting our backgrounds, if you like, I started off in the research department at the Scottish Tourist Board back in the 90s. I was there for 8 years and then moved agency side. Duncan's got a similar background to me. We both worked agency side, worked on with System 3 initially. Some of you may remember that name from the past, and then it became TNS and then Kantar, and we ran the big national domestic tourism surveys, the UK Tourism Survey, later to become the Great Britain Tourism Survey, and the Great Britain Day Visits Survey. We both individually managed these two surveys on behalf of the National Tourist Board. So our hearts are in tourism. We've both got tourism degrees. I've got a postgrad in tourism from Strathclyde from way back, and Duncan's got a degree in tourism and hospitality from Napier. So we kind of feel we're back in the working with the sector we enjoy most. It's where we've invested most of our efforts and time over the years. If you're wondering where our name comes from and our backgrounds in terms of literally what you see behind us, 56 degree line of latitude is roughly where Edinburgh is. It kind of goes through the Forth Bridges, to be honest with you. It's just Edinburgh's just below that. And it reflects that's the area that we're based. I'm actually based in the Borders, albeit just. That's the Pentland Hills behind me. In Carlops, which is 15 miles south of Edinburgh, and Duncan's in South Queensferry, just at the bridges themselves, hence his backdrop. So in normal times, we work from Edinburgh, but obviously times are not normal, so we're working from home, like everybody else is, or most people are at the moment. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to split the presentation.
Laurie, I don't know if it's just me, but I think we maybe lost the connection to Jim.
I have lost the connection to Jim as well.
Yeah, yes, okay. I suggest it must be an issue with his Wi-Fi. What I suggest we do then is, if I can share my screen, maybe I can take over, and then if Jim gets back into things, we can hand back to him.
Sure.
Sorry about this. Yep. Okay. Right. 1 second. I'll just Oh, Jim, you're back. Jim is back. Jim, you're still muted. Sorry about this.
Apologies, guys.
Yeah.
My internet decided it wasn't
right. We were about to hand over to me, but you want to pick it up from where you were, Jim?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just share this again. So apologies. I was on this screen. Hopefully that's where.
Yes, that's where we got to.
So I'll do the first half. Duncan will do the second half, and he'll focus more on the Scottish tourism markets themselves. So what is the survey all about? Well, we were conscious early in April that there wasn't a great deal of information out there about how people were feeling about tourism at that time, early in the stages of lockdown. Visit Scotland hadn't got any surveys off the ground, and we felt there was a real need for some information about the Scottish tourism markets. So we decided in late April that we would launch our own survey to try to help the industry by providing answers to some key questions. We wanted to monitor the views and opinions of people resident in Scotland, so the Scottish resident population, on tourism during lockdown and how it evolves as restrictions lifted. So we wanted to get an idea of how people felt about tourism when they were able to take trips again. First wave was undertaken in the first week of May, but this presentation focuses on the second wave, which was in the first week of June. We're going to run it on a monthly basis to just track how people are feeling about tourism generally. And in this June wave, some of you may have seen the early research. In the June wave, we've built on that. We've got some tracking information, but we've also got more information on new questions, new areas of investigation. As the pandemic and lockdown has evolved, new things have come into play that we wanted to test, and you'll see that as we go through. Survey is representative of the Scottish population. It was undertaken online, so it's based on a representative sample of Scottish adults, undertaken online by Populous, who are one of the big panel providers, and we've got a national sample of 500, which is big enough for this type of study to get an idea of national views on tourism. So across both ways, we've spoken to 1,000 Scots already, basically. We're happy for you to share these results if you find them useful with anyone, use them as you see fit. We're really keen that this gets out into the hands of the people who really need the information in the industry. So that's enough background. I'm conscious that I don't want my internet to go off again. So let's begin by examining how Scots feel about travel generally just now, not just in Scotland, but anywhere. Now, in early May, we saw that Scots had a wide range of feelings about future holiday taking, ranging from a fear to travel again to a desire to quickly get back to normal. It's worth looking at this again because it does provide the context. So there's a wide spectrum of opinion towards holidays and breaks, and a real polarization between those for whom COVID-19 has a minimal impact on their future travel plans and thoughts, to those at the other end of the spectrum, but a real nervousness about the prospect of traveling in the future. And you can see that on this chart on the screen. On the left-hand side, those who are scared and nervous about travel are feeling very, very wary back in early May. You know, tourism was not something that they were wanting to think about. The whole idea of leaving the home and so on generally had them in that state. So 11% of the population felt that way. So that's a big proportion of an otherwise mobile market. On the other end of the scale, we've got the 17% who basically said, well, as soon as things get back to normal again, as soon as I can get out of the house and start traveling again, I'm going to do it because I'm desperate to go traveling again. I'm not scared to go to places. My opinion on travel hasn't changed at all. But as you'll imagine, most people are somewhere between these two extremes. Around about 3/4 of Scots were in that big orange segment in the middle. I'm not going to read out all the quotes, but different levels of nervousness, different levels of caution, reflecting the situation we're in at the time. So 1 month on, we've investigated how Scots feel about specific aspects of travel in a little bit more detail. Now, first of all, two areas of concern underpin how Scots feel about travel at the moment: financial considerations and the choices they need to make about getting around and the forms of transport they'd consider. Both waves of our survey suggest around a third of Scots feel that their personal finances have been significantly negatively impacted by the COVID lockdown. So that's the top bars there, or the top pie charts there, 33%. It's not uniform across the population. It's more likely to be amongst those who are in C2DE social classes and families and the under 35s, the working population. Many people are on furlough. Some have been unfortunately already made unemployed and so on. So we've got to bear this in mind. A third of Scots adults are significantly affected financially. And it doesn't mean that the others are not, but they have said it's significant. So that's going to have an impact on travel and travel behaviours going forward. And that's been consistent across both waves. However, below that, you'll see that transport choices are now more front of mind and causing Scots to think long and hard on how they'll travel around post-lockdown than was the case in early May. Even in May, 3/4 said it was front of mind and something they were thinking about. By June, it had gone up to 83%. And that probably reflects the fact that we're getting closer to the position where we're getting out of our houses more often. Public transport has always been available, but it's more likely to be considered for everyday life. Some people going back to work, going shopping and so on when the shops reopen, hopefully in a couple of weeks' time. So people are thinking about these things more. So it's more front of mind. And obviously the introduction this week of the mandatory wearing of face masks on, or face coverings, I should say, on public transport helps to ensure that is something that's front of mind for people. So these two areas are kind of underpinning a lot of the things that we're talking about in the rest of this presentation. Now, we asked some new questions though, and this is where it gets quite interesting, I would argue, in terms of the timing of this. We undertook the survey between the 1st and 4th of June, and at that time, the idea of quarantine on returning to the UK following an overseas trip was very much headline news. It was just about to be made mandatory, just about to be introduced, and it was very much headline news. And our survey shows that the prospect of quarantine when returning from a trip abroad
Laurie, I think
we've got a bit of freezing, Jim.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, shall we, I'll share the screen from this point, and if Jim rejoins, he can take over with the voiceover. Right, I will attempt to, I will attempt to do that now. Sorry about this, okay.
Well, I think it's a challenge we're all used to in these days of multiple Zoom calls. Our infrastructure just can't cope.
Yeah, indeed, right. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Thumbs up.
Good, excellent. Okay, I'll take over. Oh, Jim is back now, but I suggest, Jim, I suggest we keep sharing my screen in case you don't drop out, but tell me to move the slide forward. So I think you're on this one. I'll let you carry on.
No, that's fine, that's fine. Yes, apologies. I don't know what's going on with my internet today, but the prospects of quarantine, as I say, are dampening desire to travel abroad anywhere. 63% likely to avoid travelling to continental Europe, and an even larger proportion, at the bottom bar, 75% likely to reject long-haul travel. Empty nesters in particular are more likely to have concerns about each of these issues, whereas there is lower concern amongst younger people, pre-families and so on. So a clear unwillingness amongst most Scots to consider travelling abroad anytime soon, and the prospects of self-quarantine are clearly a major barrier. But paradoxically, this might provide some opportunities for the domestic tourism industry, and we'll see how domestic tourism prospects are looking in a few minutes' time. So health and safety concerns around coronavirus are still playing a major role when it comes to travel considerations, and three elements in particular will shape the nature of holiday choices in the months ahead. Social distancing at the top. Now, it's very much headline news at the moment, I'm aware, within the tourism industry around whether it should be 2 metre, the 2 metres should be reduced to 1 metre. I know the Scottish Tourism Alliance are very strongly pushing for that. But social distancing, however it looks, is a concern for people. For most Scots would show a lot of reticence in the prospect of visiting places where social distancing might be difficult, be that beaches, transport hubs, inside places. Almost 3/4 of Scots would actively avoid or try to avoid visiting such places for the foreseeable future. So clearly social distancing is a priority, but if we look just below that, many would also want to avoid places where there were simply lots of people. Over 2/3 would avoid going to busy places. Now, again, thinking about your area in Moray and Speyside, that could be an opportunity, undoubtedly. But if we look below, the final bar at the bottom, I think is one of the most important ones that we're going to share with you today. The biggest COVID-related health and safety concern for future travel is around cleanliness and hygiene, with 8 in every 10 Scots avoiding visiting places where there's no guarantees or assurances on hygiene available. Now, I know Visit Scotland have signed up for the Visit Britain scheme in the last day or so, which I think is exactly the sort of thing people are looking for. And when we look at Scottish holidays in a few moments' time, and Duncan covers that, you'll see that the same desire for a Scottish holiday as there would be going anywhere else for that type of reassurance. So if we go on to the next slide, we saw earlier that transport choices post-lockdown will be carefully considered by most Scots. But when we drill down to look at 3 particular modes, we can begin to see where the barriers are likely to be largest. First of all, air travel. We all know that air travel is affected and will continue to be affected. And this data just backs that up. I mean, 41% of Scots will simply not set foot on a plane for the foreseeable future under any circumstances. And another 27% are saying they would only do so if there was absolutely no other choice open for them. So this really does illustrate the difficulties that the air industry is going to have in its road to recovery, as demand's likely to be suppressed for some time. Now, underneath though, in terms of public transport, although there's still a large proportion of Scots who will not take public transport, such as trains or buses in the near future, I mean, 27% saying they'll avoid it completely, and 36% will only do so if there's no other choices. Almost 4 in 10 would consider these modes of travel. And I think that just reflects the reality that many will be likely to travel by these means in everyday life at some point in the near future anyway. So they're not going to rule it out completely as a barrier for holidays, but for most, it's still something they'll try to avoid if there's an alternative. And unfortunately, one of the areas of tourism that's going to suffer most, and again, there's no surprises in any of this, but is the cruise industry. And 7 in 10 Scots will completely avoid this type of holiday under any circumstances, and another 14% would only do so if there wasn't any choice, basically. And this illustrates that even more than air travel, the cruise industry faces the longest period to recover. And it's not really surprising when you think about the nature of that type of trip, but also their main market tends to be empty nesters who, as we'll see as we go on through the presentation, are more likely to be reticent towards travel to any destination. Okay, so that's enough background around how Scots are feeling about travel, but now let's get a bit more specific in terms of the types of trips and where they might be considering. The analysis we're about to share identifies what Scots might do and where they might go first, and where tourism recovery may happen first. We've called this the Tourism Desirability Score. It's a measure of the relative appeal among Scots of different types of day and overnight trips to Scotland, elsewhere in Britain or overseas, when such trips become possible again. And we've looked at 3 different levels. We've looked at the countryside and rural areas, we've looked at seaside and coast, and towns and cities. And for each of those different scenarios, we've asked people to give it a score from 1 to 10. 1 being extremely unlikely to be the type of trip I'd consider anytime soon to that type of destination or to that destination, to 10 being extremely likely to be the type of trip I would consider as soon as it's feasible. So basically, the higher the score, the more desire that type of trip has for Scots. And we've actually converted the numbers into a score out of 100 because it's often easier for people to see an index out of 100 than a score out of 10. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll see how the top level findings look. So we've got 4 bars here with 2 sets of numbers in each. The first one on the left is all destinations for overnight tourism. So we've looked at Scotland, we've looked at other UK, and we've looked at overseas. When we group all these different destinations together, we get an overall tourism desirability score. And the figure for June is in blue at 46 out of 100. Now, we don't have anything to compare that against pre-COVID, but we all know how much people like tourism and holidays and travel. So it would have been significantly higher than that to, you know, when we look at that figure. I mean, it would certainly be well above 70 into the 80s, I would guess. It's also down, however, from the May figure, which is in grey alongside it, which is 49. And that is mainly a reflection of what has happened, I would argue, south of the border over the 4 weeks of May. We look first of all, though, at Scotland. the tourism desirability score is higher. It's at 58, which is pretty much what it was at in May. It's down 1 point, which isn't really significant. So basically what this is saying is that among Scots, taking an overnight trip in Scotland has the greatest appeal for me at the moment versus going further afield, especially to overseas where the index is 40, but there's been a big drop in trips to other parts of Great Britain in the 4 weeks of May. And if we think back to some of the images we saw in May of overcrowded beaches and so on, I think that has definitely been playing a role in that decision. So we go on to the next slide. Let's look at day trips in Scotland, first of all. So all that stuff we've looked at so far was overnights. Before we look at overnights in each destination in more detail, let's look at day trips taken in Scotland. And this is where desirability is highest. This is the first opportunity, if you like, for the tourism industry to get business back, if you like, for parts of the tourism industry. People have been used to being in their own small area over the last 10 weeks or so, 11 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it is now. I think we're all losing track. So when things are opened up a bit more and we can travel more than 5 miles and the industry starts hopefully reopening from 15th of July onwards, the first places people will want to go will be day trip destinations. They want to initially have that, for most people, the security of returning home, the safety of their own haven, their own home at the end of the day, rather than maybe staying away from home initially. And I think that's just a natural feeling of just baby steps first before we take an overnight trip. And you'll see here that when we look at the different types of destination, the countryside is the most appealing with a score of 72 out of 100. And that's very slightly up on May, as is seaside and coast, which is up 1 point on May as well to 70, just not far behind at all. Trips to cities and towns in Scotland, day trips, a bit less appealing at the moment for obvious reasons. People are wanting to avoid crowds and people and so on, but still undoubtedly opportunities there. So for places like Inverness or Elgin or Abbeymoor or whatever, people won't necessarily avoid them, but the real desire is the outdoors and open space at the moment. So if we look at overnight tourism in Scotland on the next slide, this really shows a very similar pattern, if you like, a greater appeal for the countryside and rural areas, slightly ahead of the seaside and coast, and ahead again of cities and towns. And these figures haven't moved much at all, really, in the last month. In fact, countryside and seaside areas, overnight trips to these areas have remained exactly the same as it was the case in May. But there is a slight dropping in appeal of the idea of going to cities. And again, we'll be tracking that in July and August and see how that changes as lockdown restrictions ease further. Now we move to the next slide. You see quite a big drop in terms of appeal. The idea of going to other parts of the UK or other parts of Britain, quite a big drop. And we've already talked about the reasons for that, but there's actually been quite a big drop in the idea of UK city breaks as well, from 47 to 42 from May. And also, as we said, the seaside 44 to 41. So Scotland's appeal, if anything, is strengthened, it's solidified, whereas the rest of the UK is less appealing to Scots at the moment. And if we look at the last slide in this series, overseas trips, it's that little bit less appealing again than other parts of the UK, simply because you're going further afield. We already saw that continental Europe had a low appeal, and then the rest of the world was even lower. I mean, it's all about distance from home in many ways, away from the safety and security of where you live. And you'll see there that in particular, overseas trips to the countryside have got least appeal, but that would always be the case. It's overseas city breaks and the sun, sea and sand type holidays are always going to be more popular, but they are quite depressed at the moment, as you can see. So we'll look at this final slide in this section that looks at the league table, if you like, of desirability. It's all the figures you've seen already. It just highlights just how much of an opportunity there is for Scotland and destinations in Scotland, particularly rural destinations in Scotland, particularly for day trips initially, but overnights not far behind. And I think it just does illustrate that there is some light at the end of the tunnel from that domestic market. The figures in green and red just are showing the difference from the previous month, and most of the reds are actually found south of the border and overseas. with Scotland largely retaining its levels of desirability to early May. Now, when we look at it broken down on the next slide by life cycle, I've already kind of hinted on this already. Scottish pre-families have the highest desire. So people aged under 35 without any kids, they've got the highest levels of desire to travel to all destinations. You can see the figures there for June, for day trips at 72, holidays and breaks in Scotland at 65. Both of these are above the figures overall, which were 68 and 58, I think, for these two. But also they've got a much higher level of desirability to go overseas. Not so much to go south of the border, but overseas. So maybe that traditional foreign holiday is still relatively high in the agenda of the more carefree, less things to worry about, potentially younger people. But if we look at Scottish families, it's not too dissimilar in terms of the actual scores for Scotland, certainly. Day trips, even more appealing to them. Holidays and breaks in Scotland, pretty much at the same sort of level as pre-families. And both of these figures have actually increased in popularity over the month, which again just suggests that for families there's a real potential market there for Scotland, and a decreasing desire to go elsewhere, further afield, be it south of the border or overseas. And for Scottish empty nesters, the age 55 with no kids, general lower desire to travel anywhere. Now that includes Scotland, although Scotland is, of all the areas, all the destinations we looked at, the one that has the highest level of appeal, but it's lower than the average. For day trips, it's 63, for overnights, it's 52, and just reflecting, obviously, the more vulnerable nature of that market, the more concerned that market is around COVID-19 at the moment. And obviously, that's something to be aware of, because obviously that's a very key market for Scottish tourism. Doesn't mean it's not attainable, but more assurances will have to be in place for this market, and it might not be the first to bounce back, if you like. So we go on to the next slide. This highlights how tourism areas in Scotland, how the different areas of Scotland might benefit when tourism reopens. We asked people in an open-ended way, when it's possible to travel again in Scotland, which parts of Scotland do you most want to stay in first? So it's not for day trips, it's for overnight trips. And you'll see here very clearly something that reflects what we've seen already, that the rural areas have much higher appeal than urban areas. Although Edinburgh has got a figure of 16% in normal times, Edinburgh would be much higher than that. I think from Visit Scotland's data, I think among Scots, it's more like 25 to 30% typically would be visiting Edinburgh overnight from Scotland, especially around things like the festival and so on. Glasgow at 8% is also lower than it would normally be, again reflecting the fact there's fewer events happening that people would go there for. However, the idea of visiting the Highlands, more than half are saying that's what they want to do. And they mentioned different parts of the Highlands. We've grouped them into the Visit Scotland regions deliberately just to give you something that you can compare against. But you'll see Inverness at 11%, Skye 9%, Abbeymoor and the Cairngorms at 6%, Fort William 4%, and so on and so forth. So a lot of desire to go to the Highlands, but also other rural areas, Argyll and the Isles, the Outer Hebrides, the Northern Isles, the Borders, Dumfries and Galloway, all showing higher numbers than would normally be the case. And of course, the big challenge we've all got there as an industry, the tourism industry, is how do we manage that in a way that is sustainable so that local communities don't feel overrun. And we're going to come on to that in a few minutes. Duncan's going to cover just the extent to which people are willing to go off the beaten track. And there is good news there, thankfully. So that's all I'm going to cover, maybe just as well, given my internet. Just kind of feel I'm playing it on the edge a bit at the moment. If there are any questions just now, though, Laurie, I don't know if there's any, if people want to, if there's any questions that have come through that reflect this bit, or if we want to go on to the end and take questions then, I don't mind.
Well, we've got a flow of questions.
Okay.
But I think perhaps just crack on and do them at the end.
That's fine, that makes sense. Right, Duncan, over to you.
Good. Okay, right, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go into a bit more detail in some of the areas that Jim sort of set the scene and shown the overall levels of demand and desire. I'm going to now talk a little bit more about some of the factors that are in Scots consumers' minds when they're thinking about their next holiday in Scotland, when they're planning ahead. And then we'll dive in a bit more detail around views on certain sectors, accommodation, activities, and transport particularly. So first of all, we asked an open-ended question in the survey, essentially asking people what it was that they would be thinking about, what would be the things that they would be considering when they were planning the next overnight trip they would take in Scotland, almost what's on their mind really. And we asked it in this open-ended way just to really get at the spontaneous things top of mind that were concerning people the most. Lots of long open-ended verbatim sort of answers. I'll show you some of them in a second, and then we sort of categorize them into these groups that are shown on the screen, and a number of others with sort of smaller percentages. But these were the 6 key big themes that came through from that questioning. So the biggest one, spontaneously mentioned by around about a fifth of people, were issues around and concerns around being certain about high standards of cleanliness and hygiene. And that picks up on some of the broader issues, just generally thinking about travel, but particularly when people were thinking about Scotland, in particular when they were thinking about the accommodation they'd use, people again and again said, I need to be certain that where I'm going has been properly cleaned, that there's some kind of guarantee, some kind of way that I can be sure that hygiene practices are in place. A lot of the other responses also related around areas around sort of proximity to crowds, social distancing, being in control of where people, how close people were to strangers essentially. So that came through in some of these key ones. So a lot of responses were quite emotional, almost responses that I need to be sure that I'm going to be safe, that my family are not at risk. On the right there, related, a lot of people sort of translated that into I want to avoid crowds, I want to be off the beaten track, was quite commonly said as a response. They want to escape. Often a lot of the people we surveyed live in busier city type or town environments, but their ideal is to escape all of that into somewhere in the wide and open. Transport choices also influenced by this, people saying it needs to be convenient, somewhere I can easily get to and from. So I think that's underpinning some of the initial demand for day trips, first of all, before people venture a bit further in overnight trips. And often in terms of actual choices, people saying, I'm going to take my own car, because then in a sense, they're in their own group only, they're in a bubble in a sense, and a bit more on transport in a second. And the whole social distancing thing, I mean, the message about social distancing, the 2 meters, has come through very strongly to people, over the last 10 or 12 weeks and so on. So this is something that's very much ingrained in people's mindsets, and they want to be able to go places that they're sure that they can maintain that distance. Bottom left as well, it's really important to say a lot of people are talking about price, affordability, value. We've got this sort of economic crisis happening alongside a third of people who are very worried about money. And so that's something which is there in the minds of many people, particularly younger pre-family groups who are most affected. Here's some of the specific sort of quotations that people provided us. I won't read them all out. We'll share the deck with you afterwards. You could read them in your own time. But these really do show how strongly people are feeling. I mean, one in the middle there, for example, around safety and risk. I would have to be 100% confident there would be no risk to myself, my husband, or child by traveling. The ability to social distance came through as well, that people are saying that safe social distancing away from crowds, being able to stay in our own accommodation, so e.g. tent, wigwam, hotel room, cottage cabin. So a lot of strong emotions underpinning this. A lot of this is about how people are feeling and their confidence and some fears as well. To get a bit more of a quantification around some of the issues that we're interested in, we included a number of different statements as shown on the screen here in the blue boxes. And we asked people to what extent they agreed or disagreed with each of these. And that gave us a good feel for some of the opportunities that might be coming up as things unlock. So first of all, around about the time of year people are willing to visit. We had a couple of statements on this. One of them was to what extent people would only consider taking a break in Scotland if they could do it in the summer months. The other was almost the opposite, whether or not people would consider extending the normal time they would take holidays and breaks into the autumn or winter if that was the earliest they were able to take a break. And I guess the good news for the industry here is that a minority, less than a third of people will only take a holiday if it's in the summer, but 3/4, a much larger proportion, are willing to delay and take a trip later in the season. So that suggests that there's an opportunity there for businesses to maybe open later or remain open longer and maybe recoup some of the lost business if later in the year. On the right, top right, we also asked people, we sort of tested this whole thing around going off the beaten track, because we did find, the Jim showed the map results, that when people were asked where they'd like to go, often people focus in on the very well-known destinations. Skye, Loch Ness, Arran were mentioned a lot. So there's a real issue there for those destinations of being overwhelmed by visitors, while other places, less well-known perhaps, aren't visited so much. But the response to this question showed to us that people are interested in finding out about other places, trying somewhere new, especially because that couldn't be quieter for them, that they're able to escape the crowds, and that's what they want to do. So I think there's a message there about raising the profile of less well-known destinations that people don't always just flock to. Bottom left and middle bottom as well, a couple of interesting results around sort of supporting Scottish businesses. First of all, as we've seen during sort of lockdown periods, during that time, a lot of people did a lot to try and support their own close to home local businesses when they're buying food and so on. But as we move into sort of tourism behaviour, we do have over 2/3 are keen to do what they can to spend their money in a way that benefits the Scottish tourism economy. So I think that suggests that this is relevant to people, and that's something which can be put into marketing communications, that people are doing their bit by helping. They might have spent their money overseas, but they haven't done that because that holiday's been cancelled. By holidaying at home in their local area, taking day trips, they can do their bit to help us in the recovery. The middle bar is one of the most significant results. They are respecting local communities. We're aware that a lot of communities are understandably concerned about visitors coming to the areas and the health concerns that would bring. The good news is that from a visitor's point of view, they share those concerns, they understand those concerns, and nearly everyone would want to be respectful of a local community. The last thing people want to do is go somewhere and not be welcome. So I think there's a message there again around messaging and ensuring that visitors are able to and understand what they need to do to be respectful, of community concerns. And bottom right, building on this whole, reoccurring theme where we see people talking about hygiene and health concerns, we tested the concept of some kind of checking and endorsement of establishments and facilities, and a strong result again here, 83% of people, so the vast majority of people saying, yes, I would like to see some kind of reassurance. So whether that's a grading scheme or some other approach, which basically is a stamp that tells people, yes, this place is safe, it has been endorsed as safe. So moving on to the different sectors now. So all of those areas obviously underpin a lot of the responses that we've seen, those views. Looking a bit more at the accommodation sector, just to quickly explain what you're looking at, because quite a few numbers on this chart, but essentially we asked everyone, we showed them the list of different types of accommodation that you can see here on the chart, and we asked people whether post lockdown there would be any more, any less, or no difference in terms of their preference to use these types of accommodation compared to prior to the COVID crisis. And this is all in the context of taking holidays within Scotland, of course. Now, we recognise that some people wouldn't use certain types of accommodation in any case, so that's our rejectors. So for example, someone who would never have considered before or after camping, we take them out of the analysis. So these results are just based on people who would consider these types of accommodation in the first place in normal circumstances. We get our more likely to consider bar and our less likely to consider bar, and we take one away from the other to get our net gain or loss. So that's what the number is on the right, the net gain or loss, which gives an overall ranking of the direction of movement between different types of accommodation. And the smaller font is also what we recorded in May. So that shows us how things have changed over the last month. So that explains what the numbers are, but just what does this actually all tell us? Well, essentially there's quite a clear picture where we've got a net increase in demand and interest in staying in types of accommodation where you're, I guess, self-contained in the company of yourself and your group only. So self-catering accommodation, caravan and tent are at the top of the list. We also see a sort of uplift and increasing interest in staying with relatives and friends. Now, a few things could be driving that. Some part of it is people haven't been able to spend time with and see their relatives and friends. So when they're allowed to, they'll want to do that. There's a sort of latent demand there. Also, I think there's a degree of trusting your wider family, your friends, rather than sharing a space with strangers. You're more comfortable with sharing a space with friends. And also the price and value, and people will be looking for options which don't cost so much, so staying with a friend or relative fits that as well. So these are the areas where we can see an increase in demand, but then as we go down the chart, we see the areas where there's a net decrease in demand, unfortunately. So serviced accommodation types coming through here. Small hotels and guest houses, you see a larger proportion of people less likely than more likely to consider. Larger hotels, even more the case. There's even a greater issue there. We saw in the feedback certain discussions from people or points of view from people. Sometimes if it was a small establishment that they'd stayed in before, that they knew the proprietor, they trusted them, it's a bit like staying with a friend or a relative, they would feel confident in those circumstances. Whereas larger hotels, for some people, were off-putting. Also, to some extent, a large hotel without the facilities that they would normally go to a large hotel for, such as leisure facilities, was less appealing for that reason too. Bottom of the list here, though, we see where there's a really strong negative sort of decline. Room in a private home, such as that might be available through Airbnb, 40% of the people less likely to consider. Hostels and bunkhouses, about half of people who would normally consider those are now saying they'd be less likely to, so obviously quite concerned. During the May wave of the survey, we following that question, we asked people, why do you say that? So we got a bit more detail, and some of it reflects the broader issues. But in the accommodation context, price and value for money is a big issue. That is driving why people are changing their decisions. Hygiene and cleanliness, again, coming through. Social distancing, avoiding crowds and locations. These are the sort of the really things that are on people's minds when they're choosing where to stay overnight in Scotland in future. If we move on to, we asked a similar question about the things that people would do during a holiday, a future holiday or short break in Scotland, and a whole range of different types of activities fitted into this. But some quite clear directions of movement in terms of increased demand and decreased demand into the future. So one of the big areas is the increased interest and demand to do things outdoors. So at the top of the list, we've got that visiting the natural outdoors. We've got active outdoor pursuits. We've got outdoor sports. We also included rest and relaxation. Didn't specify indoors or outdoors, but often that is tied in with engaging with nature and these types of outdoor pursuits. However, further down the list, in terms of attractions and that area, there is a decreased demand for visiting purpose-built attractions. More people saying less likely than more likely in that case. And also visiting historic properties is somewhere in the middle, possibly reflecting the fact that often a historic property might be a mix of outdoor and indoor areas. So a message there might be that if an attraction offers indoor and outdoor, to dial up and reinforce the spacious open parts of that for people. Another big change that this chart shows is in terms of how people are going to eat and drink during their visits, or how they'd like to anyway. So second from the top there, we've got a large proportion of people saying they're more likely to buy groceries or cook their own meals while on holiday. But third from the bottom, we've got a large proportion of people saying they're less likely to eat and drink out. So there is a real movement. And, alongside we see the accommodation choices, people envisaging that they will cook, they'll bring food, they'll buy food, or they'll get deliveries as well. We quite often have seen in other areas. I think the opportunity here for the tourism industry is to avoid a scenario where people stock up at their supermarket before they leave home and drive to the destination, don't spend any money. People, I guess, visitors would rather be buying local produce, so it's being able to give them the knowledge beforehand that you're able to order a hamper, or you're able to buy food, you'll be able to order in food. And that way they can actually experience local food and drink, something different, and local businesses also don't lose out from that spend. Another key theme in this chart, quite a lot in this chart within the figures, is the net decrease in interest in a few of the more cultural related activities. So we have cultural activities such as visiting theatres and museums. We have mixing and meeting locals, and we have attending events and festivals, all near the bottom of the table. And again, you can see the reasons why this is relating to social distancing and expectations that these sorts of activities would require close proximity to lots of people. But it's obviously a big issue for these businesses in these areas, events, etc. particularly, but also it's an issue as well, and it's such a strong part of the Scottish tourism product in areas such as yours is the culture, the people, the friendly welcome. So we need to think about ways that we don't lose that dimension of the tourism product, but we still reassure people that they're in a safe environment. In May, we asked people why had they made these choices and so on. And I think it just reinforces that, very strongly, the highest proportion saying it's about avoiding busy places and crowds. That's why they're changing their opinions. Spending more time outdoors, and price and value for money, once again, coming through. A lot of people spontaneously saying it's about the price of things. Okay, so the third area that we looked into is transport, the transport sector. So again, a similar format question. This time, this one just added in June as a new one. But again, we can see some quite clear patterns. Now, this question related to both transport to the destination and transport whilst within the destination to get around. So picking up on that previous sort of open-ended sort of responses we got, earlier, half of people are more likely to consider taking their own car. So there's a really large net increase in the desire to use their own car rather than other modes of transport. And that's because people feel that they're safe in that environment, they're in control, and it's just the easiest, simplest way for them to travel in their minds without risk. Walking and cycling also large net increases. This is likely to be predominantly within the destination. It kind of reflects a lot of the messages we're getting around commuting and transport close to home and so on, active travel, etc. There could be opportunities there for the tourism industry and destinations to think about highlighting where and how you can walk, walking tours, guides, etc., linking up with activity providers who offer bike, cycle hire, etc. And this also reflects the changes in interest in different activities, so outdoor pursuits as well as just walking and cycling for transport purposes. Camper van, also a net increase reflecting some of the accommodation choice changes that we saw as well. But then as we go down the table, we move into modes of transport where larger shares of people are less likely to consider than more likely to consider. And so we see ferries, less negatively impacted than others, possibly because of the ability to have outdoor space as well, and it's perhaps more spacious. Hire car, train, net negative impact, but not as bad as some of the others that we're coming on to. And this is an area where, with people maybe are using trains or regular buses more in their day-to-day life. So there is a proportion of people who say it's no different or even I'm more likely to consider over others, but generally it's a negative. Traveling by plane during a holiday in Scotland or to get to your destination is a net decrease as well. So that has implications for the Isles, for example. And organised coach tours very much decrease. So, I mean, unfortunately, we have seen how some of the coach operators have already gone out of business. And I think there is a real decrease in desire. That may well reflect the core market for that group as well, that more conscious, more worried older age group in particular. So there's a real issue around that mode of transport particularly. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm just going to quickly sort of provide a few summary slides, and then we can maybe do a few questions. So, I mean, just to sort of summarize the key points, the context to all of this, as Jim went through, we need to remember the financial, economic impacts of this. We need to bear in mind that how people travel, in general for holidays, not just for in Scotland, are influencing choices and making people less likely to want to travel abroad. And the quarantine is obviously a big impact for that. And also, though, underpinning all of this, the cleanliness and hygiene and the locations and social distancing is underpinning a lot of that. But in some ways, that greater fear and reduced demand to travel outside of Scotland does maybe provide some kind of opportunities for Scotland. First of all, day trips, and then potentially to more rural destinations such as your own. There are positives around extending the season, going off the beaten track. There are positives around people's desire to support Scottish tourism businesses, to respect communities, but there is that demand for some kind of accreditation or reassurance as well. And as I've just gone through, there's a lot of kind of quite niche results, focused results around the types of accommodation, the things people want to do, how they want to eat and drink, transport choices, etc. I won't spend long on this, but we're always quite interested in seeing good case studies of businesses who are doing things in a way that kind of reflects these changing consumer needs and attitudes. So just quickly going through there, here's 4 examples from different parts of the world. In Singapore, there's a scheme being launched called SG Clean. They've launched it a little while ago, and this is an accreditation scheme that's been rolled out, and where there is companies self-certify and sign up to doing certain procedures. Then that's promoted on a website, on the communications, on a plaque in the establishment. So I'm pleased to hear that similar schemes are being considered and rolled out in Scotland as well. Haven Holidays are quite a good example there, in that what they've done is they've very much simplified their offer. Said when we reopen, we'll be providing this, but they've dialed up the self-contained accommodation, outdoor activities, takeaway and delivery food, and also their pricing's been adjusted to reflect the simplified package, and they're offering full money back if someone cancels because of a COVID-19 related sort of issue. So they're giving that reassurance. Using technology to manage visitor numbers is also a big thing. There's one example in Cinque Terre villages in Italy where they've actually, this is pre-COVID, more to do with over-tourism, but using technology to do online ticketing, so to manage when people arrive, so people don't all come at once and overwhelm a destination. There's going to be a lot of thinking required to bring that kind of thing into attractions. And finally, Brewdog, a closer to home brand. A great example there, though, in terms of what they've been doing, I think, in terms of keeping in touch with their customers, saying our pubs aren't open yet, but when they do eventually, we're going to welcome you back, but also here are the things we're doing. And they had a nice little video showing this is our hygiene, this is the things that are very reassuring, just making people trust them. And there's loads of other great examples out there, which you've no doubt seen, of how to communicate and keep in touch with your customers. I think that's very important. Okay, so that's us. Happy to take any questions now.
Gosh,
got there.
there was a lot in there.
Yes, indeed.
So do you guys mind if we do 2 or 3 quick fires?
Sure. Go for it.
Okay, so I think you've kind of answered this, but how long do you think people would travel for a day trip? How long from further afield?
I started typing an answer on that one there just a few minutes ago. Typically, I mean, we won't ask that question in this survey, but we do know from the Great Britain Day Visit survey what the average trip length is for a day trip and so on. And for the types of trips we're talking about, where people are going to the countryside or whatever, we can get actual figures for you. We can pass this on afterwards. I think you're looking at 4 or 5 hours maximum away from home. Maybe an hour of travel each direction.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think most people wouldn't travel more than an hour unless they're very avid sort of hill walkers, desperate to get to somewhere and it sets off early. They want to spend more time at the destination than traveling.
Yes, perfect. Are there any figures around about how English visitors might score on the respect local communities question?
Not from our survey.
No.
Unfortunately, I don't know if the Visit Scotland National Tourist Board survey, which is just fairly recently launched.
Not seen anything. No.
Yeah.
Okay, no worries. Right. Okay, so I think you've answered this. This is from Anne, lovely Anne Miller. Can you tell us about likely demand for self-catering? I think we've established that self-catering operators are probably in the box seat to make the best of what is an unfortunate situation.
Very much so, yeah.
Interestingly, we're in a reasonably good place in that respect, but I'm very interested in the concept of people not buying their food before they get here and not going to Tesco to load their vans up. So we're looking at something which might enable people to order food to their self-catering property. So that's quite a good one. Okay, so it's one thing, the government producing cleaning guidelines for the tourism sector. Oh yes, but it's entirely different getting people to follow them. So how can we demonstrate that we are following the guidelines, and how can we instill confidence in guests? I think some of that is in the last bit there around a charter mark or a confidence scheme.
Yeah, I think with these schemes would certainly help it will always rely on, because at this time particularly, you can't have an inspector going around checking. It's about sort of sort of doing it yourself and saying
sure.
exactly. I think also there's a broader thing which we've seen, and sometimes it isn't just about that sticker on the window or the badge on the website. It's also about trusting more generally the operator is doing the right thing. So sometimes it would be looking at pre-COVID TripAdvisor reviews, and if there's lots of 5 stars, that's a reputable place. And and we do see often actually people saying they go back to the same B&B or hotel that they've been to before because they know the owner and they trust them, and that's where the small businesses can do well. We also saw some people saying, I'd go to a big hotel, but it'd have to be a good brand. So in some ways, we suspect if someone always thinks Premier Inn's better than Travelodge, they'll choose Premier Inn because they're not so sure the other brand's going to be as good, that kind of thing. About confidence.
The other quick point I'd add to that is we saw some really good social media stuff just yesterday from Rabbi's, the Rabbi's tours. Very, very true to their brand, really nice, well done in a reassuring, trusting sort of way, which I thought was excellent. And then we saw something else from, and again, it's not your area, so I'll say it, Seamill Hydro, which basically an image which was trying to reassure people about safety and security, but actually looked like an image from a hospital with with somebody getting their temperature checked, and it wasn't good at all, and certainly was not the image you want to be portraying.
I think there's a balance. It's about the trusting and so on. I mean, someone else in a different webinar said, don't put hospital into hospitality. You know, you don't want to it's about trust and confidence and doing the right things, and things that aren't maybe hugely visible. I mean, hand sanitizer and so on, that's great, but I think it's about just saying, making people believe that you are, concerned and you are genuinely doing the right thing.
Trust. Yeah.
Okay, spot on. So there's 4 in 1, which I can pick up a couple of from our friends at the Gables Whiskey B&B in Dufton, which kind of go into this. Do you know what the feeling is among local communities, across the piece, but our community, as regards the opening up of tourism? So we know obviously that Fergus said prepare to reopen from the 15th, and we'll let you know on the 9th if you really actually can. We sense, particularly in Moray Speyside, that there's a fear, there's a lack of what they don't know quite. So that fear is potentially worse because people aren't getting clear messaging. We're doing a bit of work speaking to communities to try and establish what they're worried about, what we can do. But do you get a wider sense of communities being ready to welcome visitors back?
We didn't cover it in this wave of the survey, but we do want to cover it in early July, and these results will be available round about that week. Week will be the 15th. That's when they'll be available, which I know doesn't answer the question now, but it is a very difficult one, and maybe one of the more reassuring things is that people are willing to be dispersed and to try new places. That might help. Anyway.
I think that's it. When you see on TV hordes of people in crowds, most of the people in the crowd probably didn't want to be in a crowd, if that makes sense. But they all have the same bright idea at once and go to the same place. So if there's some way of taking that opportunity to get people to go elsewhere and to spread out the time they visit, and hopefully I mean, some other data I've seen more about going back to shops when they reopen and bars and cafes, less so just tourism, suggests that most people would like to see businesses open again, but not everyone's going to rush out the first day they open and queue outside, so I think there will hopefully be a degree of sense in most people sort of getting back out there. It won't be huge crowds, but as Jim said, I think it's something that we should cover in our next survey because it is of Scots, so we can ask Scots about, as a resident of an area, how do you feel as well?
So we're looking at not a charter mark per se, but a regional quality standard that would align to the protocols from the self-caterers and Visit Scotland. We're very supportive of the good to go standard, but there seems to be a bit of a demand here for something which is regionally specific. Now, there's one from our friend Stuart over at Macallan. What is the biggest challenge Moray Speyside has against other destinations areas in Scotland to attract short breaks? I think that's one for me, probably. I think actually, Stuart, we have very few challenges other than to get the message out far and wide at the right time that our region is open and you can be confident that you can visit Moray Speyside when you're ready to do so. For me, always, I have thought that we have all of the raw ingredients to make a perfect holiday, whether that's a 2-3 day short break or an extended break. Particularly as we go towards the end of the season, we've got dark skies, we've got northern lights, we've got an award-winning, world-famous coastline. We are not over-toured. We don't suffer from the same challenges as the honeypot destinations. For me, although it sounds strange to say, these are all the things that previously were considered disadvantages for Moray Speyside, but which now absolutely we can play as strengths.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have anything else on that, but that feels to me like we're in a good place to do the best we can.
I completely agree. I think that there's a desire amongst, what we're seeing here is a desire amongst Scots to go somewhere different, somewhere new. They don't want to necessarily go back to Loch Lomond side. They might want to, but they'll think, oh, actually, I'll go somewhere else instead, or, you know, wherever we're talking about. And I think you're in a really good position because you've got good transport links from, you know, north, south, and you know, from, you could argue from Aberdeen. I know there's debate on that one, but you know, you've got good transport links, easy to get.
And I think, yeah, you take a lot of the boxes for when you look at what people say they'd want and then look at what you offer, you match it very well. And I think part of it is that opportunity also to sort of enhance the offer by, you know, about it's not just accommodation and countryside, it's attractions, it's food and drink, it's all of that in a package. And part of that, we had another call the other day. Sometimes people are worried about price, but also it's about value, being sure that you'll get a great value holiday there. Look at all the things that you can do when you get there.
Okay, one which kind of ties two together. One from Stephen Gordon McPhail and a second one from our friends at the Gables. This is essentially about, well, what if things are open or what if things are not open? So if we have visitors come here and nothing's open, won't be a very good break. If we have everything open but we don't communicate it properly. So I can give you some assurance on that, guys, everyone over there. We are speaking to primarily at this point the distilleries, then to the accommodation providers, to get a coordinated message that what is open, when it's open, how it's open. We need to get that to a place where visitors are easy to get that information either from a website or an app. But in essence, we need to ensure that as a region, all of us, accommodation providers, visitor attractions, share that information and are happy to share that information with each other. Because the last thing we want is an influx of visitors to hotspots, which then becomes not only a challenge for those visitors and those businesses, but it takes us to the point where communities are scared and reticent. So we are working really hard at the moment to establish who's opening when and how, and what measures are being put in place in the visitor attractions to guarantee that confidence of visit. I hope that answers Stephen and Gable's question. There was one about when overseas visitors might come back. I think we're looking at, it's certainly not this year, as far as I can see, maybe early-ish next year.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I would agree. I mean, who knows at the end of the day? And but you know, if there's another, you know, if there's an autumn wave, God forbid, of the virus again, who knows? But at the moment, I don't think we're looking at this year, certainly.
Yeah, I think the quarantine rules, etc., and there may also be a degree of people putting off booking going to the UK from overseas generally because of they see where the UK is and things, and I hate to say the word, but also there's a Brexit looming as well, and so there's all sorts of factors which may unfortunately depress demand until next year.
You said something about breakfast, the breakfast factor?
Breakfast, yeah, breakfast.
Yeah,
that's it, yeah.
I don't know what this we're not sure what this B word is.
Almost forgotten about that.
Now this is, I think this might have to be our last because I know we're running over time, but this is a really interesting one. So this is from Brian Welsh, who has lovely self-catering property. What do you think the government guidelines will be for guests who exhibit COVID symptoms or are contacted through track and trace when on holiday? It may not always be possible or desirable to travel home to self-isolate. I suspect that's above our pay grades.
Suspect so.
But that is absolutely getting to the heart of it.
Yeah.
For us here to have managed ourselves through this very difficult period, it's a very tricky balancing act.
Yeah.
And I hear today that there won't be the much vaunted Isle of Wight app, but there might be a different app.
Yes, heard that.
I don't know what you want to say about that, if anything, other than it's probably one we can answer offline over an extended period, Brian.
Yeah, it's beyond the scope of things that we've got into in our survey data, that area. But yeah,
I think it's a live and real consideration, though, because if we're welcoming people to our region, and we all know about incubation times, etc.
I mean, it's probably another example of why there is so much reticence from the government to open things up too quickly, because until they've got track and trace working the way they want it to be working, and the virus suppressed enough, then adding a tourism element into the mix I personally hadn't even thought of that, but I can understand completely where that question.
Totally.
Gosh. Well, guys, thank you.
Thank you.
And perhaps we can invite you back again as things progress.
I'd love to come back.
For those, sorry, just after you guys.
I was just literally just going to say thank you again from us, and apologies again about my internet. I've since discovered it's a Sky internet problem. It wasn't my own internet, so I feel slightly better about that.
So it wasn't a teenager using your bandwidth, eh?
For once, no. For once.
So from Visit Moray Speyside, thank you to everyone. Our plans clearly are slightly different than we'd planned them to be, but there's a lot of work going on in the background. Much of it will come forward in the next couple of weeks. Our priority is at the moment to understand communities' concerns so that we can adequately put together, and this goes to one very last question from the Gables, a marketing campaign to attract people here at the right time, and only when we can be assured that sufficient confidence in our communities, our visitors, and our businesses who welcome those visitors. So that is ongoing. We will have further events of this nature over the coming weeks, and we'll be in touch with everyone. Now, I think you said that we're going to circulate the slide deck.
Yes, we've actually both separately put links to the deck in the
little chat box down there, and pretend I'm a YouTube star. I can point to the links box.
See, on me, it's over there. It's on the right-hand side.
Smash the subscribe button, guys. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, particularly Duncan and Jim. This has been a really interesting insight. Have a nice weekend.